Welcome to Season 3 of Guest the Year. Today's setlist curator is Annabelle Walsh, a fashion theorist, educator, and cultural researcher. Currently a lecturer at Parsons School of Design, Annabelle investigates the intersections of subculture, fashion theory, material culture, and cultural studies. Her thesis project at Parsons was entitled Fashion is Dead, The Long, Strange History of Deadhead Style. She is presented at the Dead Studies Association Conference, and her Instagram is @sartorialpsychic, and I will include that in the show notes. Welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me.
All right, here's how the game works. We'll play the first part of a Grateful Dead live track, and each contestant will use the messaging system to silently guess which year their performance is from. Contestants who are all on a video conference together can message in their guesses at any time during the clip or in the 10 seconds after it concludes. Whoever is furthest from the correct year is eliminated. The last two Deadheads standing will hear 3 tracks, and whoever is closest to the correct year in aggregate wins. We've got our returning champ Pete here with us, and we'll meet the rest of the Deadheads in a moment, but first, without further ado, the Grateful Dead.
Oof. I'm lost.
Yeah, that was a tough start.
Holy.
Hey, it's season 3.
What the fuck?
I'm sorry, guys, for the tough first pick. I hope it gets easier.
Okay, the guesses are in. It was playing in the band at Colt Park in Hartford, Connecticut on August 2nd, 1976. That was a K Gatto odd seeded by Jay Weiss. Annabelle, not pulling any punches. Tell us about that playing.
No, I'm not messing around in season 3, Mike. I chose this playing in the band because it's from my dad's very first Dead show. So this was my dad's first show, Colt Park, 76. And in talking about the show with my dad and asking him to recount his memories of the show, one of the things that stood out to him that he remembers is that during playing in the band, the jams seemed to go on for so long that he almost forgot what song they were playing. And I feel that that's very emblematic of the role that playing in the band fulfills within the Dead's repertoire. It's one of those songs that's sort of a vehicle for extended jamming, experimentation, and is often taken to these strange, unfamiliar places. I find that this particular jam feels almost a little bit disconcerting and uncomfortable. And I think that fits within the broader experience, or my father's broader experience of his first Dead show. It was a very chaotic show, to say the least. The Hells Angels were moonlighting as security that night. So coming into the show, they were searching everyone, confiscating their drugs and alcohol. So already kind of set the tone for the evening. Later seen during the show, according to my father, consuming said confiscated alcohol. And then towards the end of the show, during the set 2 closer, Around and Around, the Dead walk off the stage, as they do. My dad and his friends are waiting around for the requisite encore. But for whatever reason, the Dead took longer than they normally would to come back on stage. So my dad and his friends are waiting around, but eventually people just start leaving the show. They figure there's not going to be an encore. And eventually the house lights go on. So my dad and his friends are starting to make their way out of the venue when all of a sudden the band comes back on stage after about 30 minutes for the encore. So luckily my dad and his friends hadn't left the venue yet. So they were able to get back and get pretty close to the stage for the encore. But a lot of people had already left the venue. And were not allowed back in. Security wasn't letting people back in. So people started climbing over the gates to try and get back in. And there were arrests that were made. It started to get very violent. And people started to throw bottles and rocks and sticks over the gate. So there are things being thrown over the gate into the venue. It all just sort of devolves into chaos during the encore. Once the Dead wrap and they finish the encore, my dad and his friends, they decide to make their way out of the venue, but they're trying to avoid the chaos. So they hop a fence over at the back of the venue. And as they're climbing the fence, these reporters from the local news show up and they film my dad and his friends climbing over the fence. And according to my father, they ended up on the 11 p.m. news that night and they were framed as concert crashers, which was not the case. They were just trying to get out safely from the show. So a very chaotic first Grateful Dead concert experience, to say the least. Luckily, the Dead more than made up for it at my dad's second show a year later, a show that no one ever talks about, no one really knows about, May 8th, 1977 at Barton Hall.
That's great.
Do you think your dad is an entirely reliable narrator? Is there any chance he was crashing the show?
It's certainly a possibility, but I'd like to think that my father is an honest man.
Okay. Well, memory's tough, you know?
It is tough, yeah. He actually, when he was recounting the story to me, there were some lapses in memory, and then he actually went back to the summary of the show on dead.net, and he found a comment that he made 15 years ago where he was talking about his experience. So it's sort of like reading that comment and finding that comment brought back these additional memories that he'd forgotten. So the importance of documenting those memories, right?
Yeah. Two people are equally close. Pete guessed 1978 and Tomas guessed 1974. They're both on the next round because they're both 2 years off. We'll go to our returning champ, Pete. Pete is 51 from Woodbury, Connecticut. What did you make of that playing? Did you know it was playing?
It was not discernible. Jerry's guitar right away made me think of 72, like late 72. But then when I heard the audience factor come in, I was like, there's not really a ton of audience recordings from then. I honestly took a stab though, because I couldn't pick up any keys. Thought I heard two drummers and I kind of just went on that. And in hindsight, 76 makes perfect sense because there's a lot of similarities between 76 and like late 72, 73 even, where they're still loose. You know, it's not that super refined, tighten up 77, 78 stuff. Honestly, Annabelle, that is one way to start the season. It can only get easier from here is my hope. So
I hope so too. I think I psyched myself out because I'm thinking, I listened to the show and I'm like, people are so intense and detail oriented. Right. I'm thinking I have to get a little bit tricky with it. Maybe I veered too far in the other direction.
No, it was great. Tomas was also 2 years off. He guessed 1974. Tomas is 16 from Darien, Connecticut. Why did you go for 74?
Yeah, I too had no idea that I was playing in the band. I was completely lost on that. But me and my dad recently rewatched the Grateful Dead movie, that 74 movie, and it really reminded me of one of the jams they showed there. And especially Phil's, like the tone of Phil's bass. It really reminded me of that movie. And I heard the two drummers, but I know that Mickey joined them for the last show or one of the last shows, the October 20th show of that run. So I just took that risk with 74.
It's a classic case of having too much Dead knowledge, Tomas. When you guys watch it together, do you just sit down, turn off the lights, and watch it all the way through?
No talking to it, just focused. Great.
And big TV, good speakers?
Absolutely.
Good job, Tomas. You're on the next round. As is Corey, who guessed 1979. Adam guessed 1971. Let's go to Corey. He's 28 from New Jersey. Tell us about 1979, Corey.
So just like Pete and Tomas, I did not know that I was playing in the band. I thought that was Space. So I used my knowledge that they started playing Space in 78. And I heard the acoustic piano. So I knew it couldn't be really anywhere in the 80s. So I was between 79 and like 90, 91. I didn't hear two pianos, so I kind of took 91 out of there. And the audience aspect really threw me off. That's what made me think it was later. But something in me made me think it was more the 70s than the 90s. So I went with 79, and it was not space.
Well done, Corey. You're on the next round. Adam is 44 from Menlo Park. You guessed 1971, Adam. Tell us about 1971.
71 was a great year. There was a lot of exciting jams, and that just happened to not be one of them.
Adam, how did you get into the Dead?
Well, I was born and raised in Menlo Park, so I kind of feel like it was in the water a little bit as I was coming up. I haven't lived out there in quite a few years, but when I was in high school in particular, it's just sort of, I think I picked up my first book about the Grateful Dead at Kepler's Books and just kept reading about it. And then I realized that everywhere around me were all these places that all the folks were from. The chateau, I remember when they tore that down to build condos. Perry Lane, one of my best friends, lived in La Honda. So it was just like every chapter I read was like uncovering a stone in the neighborhood. So the music obviously pulled me in. 15, I was lucky enough to catch Jerry's last show in California. I was listening to it the other day. Not a great show, but we got a Unbroken Chain, and that was pretty special.
Do you think anything about the area kind of like fostered that creativity, or was it just happenstance? It could have been in Omaha or Tallahassee.
I mean, people have spilled a lot of ink speculating about those things, but yeah, I think there's something to it, or at least there used to be.
Does it bum you out that because of the cost of living, your hometown has become less of a creative breeding ground, and probably it's unlikely that any experimental band, as the Dead were in the 60s, will form in your hometown?
Well, I left and I didn't go back.
For a reason.
Yeah. I love going to visit. I love seeing my family and my friends out there, but it doesn't have the draw that it has in our imaginations.
Well, Adam, thanks for playing guest here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good luck, y'all.
Pete, Corey, and Tomas are on in the next round. All no doubt scared for whatever's next.
Yes.
I'm scared.
Let's hear Annabelle's next pick.
Love that choice.
Better?
We can devour Shakedown Streets. Love it.
So that was Shakedown at Oakland Auditorium Arena in Oakland, California on December 26th, 1979.
What? I listened to that show today.
It's
Oh my God.
That was taped by Joni Walker. Annabelle, tell us about that Shakedown.
I chose this Shakedown because December 26, 1979 marks a really important starting point in my research on the vending scene and on Deadhead material culture, specifically fashion and apparel. If you were to attempt to sort of identify or pinpoint a date or a time at which vending sort of becomes this centralized site-specific activity, I think you can make the argument that December 26th is when that happens. So prior to the Dead's New Year's run of shows at Oakland in 79 going into 80, of course, vending was still a thing starting in the early 70s. But prior to this point, vending was sort of more of an isolated, itinerant, or mobile practice. So you had people wandering around outside of the shows on foot, maybe selling t-shirts out of their backpack or holding up a piece of cardboard with jewelry affixed to it. But what changes during this run at Oakland Auditorium is on that first day, Bob Barsotti of Bill Graham Presents acquires a permit for the park that's adjacent to the venue. And his line of thinking is that people are inevitably going to set up these sort of temporary camps on the park grounds anyways, so might as well get a permit. And sure enough, he's proven correct when a few hours later, a couple dozen deadheads descend on the park and they set up their temporary camps. What happens is by December 30th, that number swells to around 150 people. And that group of people who are sort of stationed there at Peralta Park, they capture the attention of this community of people who, again, previously were just sort of selling their wares, wandering around the venue, right, in these sort of isolated, fragmented instances. So now these vendors, they realize that they have almost like this captive audience. So they too descend on the park grounds and they start selling their wares to the people who are set up in Peralta Park who are camping out. So really kind of important starting point, because as we know, in the subsequent decade, in the 80s, the vending scene just explodes. Of course, it isn't overnight, but sort of gradually over the next 10 years, it becomes such a vibrant and rich scene, and eventually a very dark scene, post Touch of Grey. Even, I think it was in fall of 89 when there was a temporary ban on vending and camping at dead shows. Of course, that didn't last for very long, but this was sort of the starting point of my research. And I've just always been amused by the fact that although it doesn't receive this nickname until many, many years later, potentially even post Jerry, I'm still trying to figure out when the name emerges. I just find it sort of serendipitous that the Dead played Shakedown Street on the night that the lot scene sort of emerges.
The tie-dye and long dresses that became ubiquitous on Shakedown, were those being worn at shows beforehand, or did the marketplace kind of like push them onto Deadheads needing to, a product to justify setting up a booth?
Well, if you look at crowd photos pre-1980, it's interesting because you don't see a lot of tie-dye in the crowd. So tie-dye doesn't really proliferate until the 80s. I mean, it was part of the Dead's visual language from very early on with the speaker covers that were done by Rosie McGee and Courtney Pollock. But in terms of people wearing tie-dye t-shirts, that doesn't really take shape until the 80s. There were a couple people like Ed Donahue in the late 70s. He was sort of like one of the first to sell tie-dye t-shirts and sort of operate as this vendor. But tie-dye just explodes in the 80s. So a lot of these things that we think of as being almost like intrinsic to Dead style, they weren't there from the very beginning. So it's interesting to look back at crowd photos, again, from the 70s. And there are some photos where I look at the crowds and I'm like, there's nothing here that really indicates to me that this is a crowd of people at a Dead show. But when I look at crowd photos from, I would say like 85 onwards, it's so obvious, right? You see all of those sort of visual cues that we now associate with the scene.
So capitalism proliferated tie-dye. Brutal.
Sure, you could make that argument.
I thought everyone did it at home and like brought it. Oh no. Annabelle, when you go to a show, what's your general aesthetic for like a Dead or Dead adjacent show?
For someone who spends a lot of time thinking about tie-dye and thinking about t-shirts, I famously do not wear t-shirts and don't really own much tie-dye. It's not that I have an aversion to it. It's just that obviously I look at the t-shirts that are made and I look at the tie-dye art and I have such a great reverence for it. I find it so beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily flatter me. T-shirts don't look good on me. So I don't dress like a typical Deadhead. And that's actually part of why I'm so interested and kind of what brought me to this research is that for a long time I was going to shows and I often go to shows by myself and, I strike up a conversation with the person next to me. And more than once I had, a fellow Deadhead say to me, well, did your boyfriend take you here? You've been dragged here against your own will, sort of thing. And I know that part of that has to do with my age and being a woman, but I think also part of it is because I don't necessarily dress the part. And so what I often heard, especially when I was younger, is that people would say, you don't look like a Deadhead. And that was just an interesting comment to me because it made me think, well, what does it mean to look like a Deadhead, right? Again, I think there are these sort of certain stereotypes that proliferate, and there's some truth to them, right? Like tie-dye is an important aspect of the scene. Birkenstocks, long hair, sure, all of that is true. But I think what I'm trying to do with my research is also demonstrate that there are so many different ways that people can express and perform their Deadhead identity through fashion.
Amazing. Pete was closest. He got it 1979. Nice poll.
It's one of my all-time favorite Dead shows. I am a huge Fall 79 fan. I think I've said it on this podcast before. The energy that Brent brings that year is unreal. You can hear it in Jerry's playing. I mean, listen to that funk and that shakedown street. I mean, that is some deep funk going on from a band not necessarily associated with funk, but they are tapping into all of it outside of Dancing in the Streets or something like that, right? But that shakedown just takes off. It's so good. I also highly recommend the jam out of He's Gone. That same show is so good. It'll blow your mind. It's such a great show. I remember having it, the Dead released it eventually, but I had a soundboard of it like 25 years ago or something on a CD or whatever. Great pick, Annabelle. I love that you picked Shakedown Street and like it's the birth of Shakedown Street. So cool.
All right, Corey guessed 1982 and Tomas guessed 86. So Corey moves on to the next round. Corey, why 82?
So I have a very big blind spot in my listening from around 1979 to 1984. I knew that was Brent. I did not know he came in that hot, so I figured it couldn't be 79. That sounded like he was with them for some time, and that was just some deep funk. And I don't know, I was feeling 82, so that's what I went with. Great pick, Annabelle.
Tomas, you guessed 1986. Why?
Yep. So I knew it wasn't post-coma 80s because I didn't really hear the like Brent like synth or like organ type sound that you would generally hear. I couldn't really hear Bob. One of those crazy sounds might have been Bob. I don't know, but I couldn't really make out Bob, and I know he was really quiet, like in that 84 to 86, like he was probably the quietest out of all those years. So I just went with that. It makes sense that it was earlier. I should have, but yeah.
Tomas, tell us how you got into the Dead, and when did you get into the Dead?
So my dad, he's always been a Deadhead. I think he's been one since he was around my age. So I grew up hearing him like playing the songs in the car. He plays a guitar, so he'd just be playing them like at every free moment. He'd just pick up the guitar and play half step, something like that. And I just kind of picked it up. I also play guitar, so I joined him in the jams, and I slowly started learning the songs and liking them. And yeah, I saw my first Dead & Co. show in 2021, and that kind of solidified it.
When you're at a Dead & Co. show and there's just people being really sloppy, like adult grown men and women just being real sloppy, what are you like thinking, like these people suck, or like I get it, or what's going through your head?
Actually, last year when I saw Dead & Co. at the Sphere in the GA, there were this like drunk, drugged couple. I don't even know. They were extremely loud, spilling the drinks everywhere. Kind of soiled the show, if I'm being honest, because I couldn't really focus on the band. Like the Sphere is a quiet venue in general. They were right in my ear, screaming and shouting and doing whatever. And yeah, I can't stand that, if I'm being honest.
When you and your dad jam together, how do you divide up the parts? And do you jam on Dead songs or?
Yeah, Dead songs exclusively, pretty much. We kind of pick and choose within songs. Like if I say like, yo, we should play Scarlet, then I'll probably be taking the Jerry parts. But like he takes the Jerry parts on songs like Bird Song, Half Step, sometimes he takes them. So it's kind of just however we feel. Like I learned both the Jerry and Bob parts. So kind of just pick and choose how we feel that day. I was actually in a band over the summer. We were supposed to play a gig in February, but it got canceled due to a snowstorm, and the band kind of fizzled out after that. But I was able to sneak in some Dead songs. Like in our set list was Help on the Way. I was able to sneak that in.
Are any of your buds in the Dead? Or
No.
Is that generation? Okay.
No. They all know I'm a Deadhead, and they kind of joke around saying, oh, the Ungrateful Dead, like, are you listening to that band? But nah, they've never gone into it.
Little assholes, dude. Oh my God.
Right.
Yeah, they're not into it.
They'll figure it out and they'll realize you were right.
Hopefully.
Tomas, you rule, dude. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's a great experience.
I'm excited to see the new post-snowstorm band. I'm sure it'll be great.
Right.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, dude. Pete and Corey are on the finals, 3 tracks. Whoever's lowest over the 3 tracks wins and goes on to next week and Guess the Year. Let's hear Annabelle's first song of the finals. Good God.
Right?
That was really good. That was great. I wanted you to just keep playing.
I know. That's when I feel like the most narky is when I'm like, all right, let's turn off this beautiful music so we can eliminate some people.
Nice.
It's like, dude, the guesses are in. It was Peggy O at Huntington Civic Center in Huntington, West Virginia on April 16th, 1978. Annabelle, tell us about that Peggy O.
Well, I would be remiss not to include a Peggy O because if you know anything about me, it's that I am completely and utterly obsessed with Peggy O. It's by far my favorite Dead song, and I know some people will say, it's not technically a Dead song, but the Dead took that song in a completely new direction. They completely transformed this traditional folk ballad and made it something completely their own. So I would argue that it is a Dead song. And Mike, I mentioned to you that I am so obsessed with Peggy O that I have 247 songs in my iTunes library, all of which are live versions of Peggy O. And the way that came about, it's kind of a funny story. A couple summers ago, I was at my friend James's gig. He plays bass in a Dead cover band called Near Dead Experience. If you're in the New York City area, check them out. They're great. And I just mentioned in passing to James that it's been my dream for years to have a way to seamlessly listen to every single live version of Peggy O. Sure enough, 6 months later, around Christmas time, I get an envelope in the mail from James. And in that envelope is a flash drive that contains not every single version, 265, not quite, but 247 out of 265 live versions of Peggy O. So James made my dream come true. I am forever indebted to him. And the reason I chose this Peggy O in particular is because last year, Gabe Bergman came on this very podcast and he said that he is not really a fan of Peggy O, that he doesn't really get it. And I've known Gabe for 7 years. He is very well aware of my love for Peggy O. So when I heard that, I was like, this is blasphemy and it's a personal attack. And I decided that I had to take matters into my own hands and help Gabe see the light. So I enrolled Gabe in Peggy O boot camp. And the idea was that each day I would send him a different version of Peggy O, along with an explanation of why that particular version is so great. And it only took 3 days for Gabe to see the light. And it's because on day 3, I sent him this Peggy O from April 16th, 1978 at Huntington Civic Center. And it was this exact moment during Jerry's solo that changed everything for him, I'd like to think. He's probably not at the point yet where he wants to have every single version in his iTunes library, but he understands now my great love for this song.
Shout out Gabe Bergman. I watch his guitar demos sometimes despite having no idea what he's saying. Both these guys guessed 1977. Corey, what were you hearing?
Peggy O was one of the first songs that really caught my attention. I like to think I'm not alone in finding one song at a time with Grateful Dead. And Peggy-O is one of the first ones that really just struck a chord with me. Just the tragic nature of the story, but there's that hopeful aspect of it. And in general, one of my favorite things about the Dead is seeing how they transform those very classical folk songs into something completely different. Like thinking of something like Me and My Uncle also, that they take that and they really just add so much energy to it. It transforms it into a whole different beast. So when I heard that, I knew it had to be somewhere between 78 and 77. I felt like it was a little bit too clean for 78, but also they were not as clean as they should be for 77, but I ended up going with 77 on that one.
Nicely done, Corey. And Pete.
I do love Peggy-O, so I don't want to, although I wouldn't mind getting harassed to listen to it every day. But that version is exceptional. And I mean, to be honest, I think in recent years, I've probably started to take it for granted. I don't know, you listen to a band long enough, right? But I know 77 and 78 are two of the strongest years for that song. But really outstanding version, really good.
So these guys have 1 point each, but before we go on to the second song in the finals, Corey, how did you get into the Dead?
So, I feel like I've been pondering how to answer this since I started listening to your podcast, but it all starts back in middle school. I never really liked music until I got into rap music, of all things. It's kind of what all my friends were into. And then as I started getting a little bit older, it was just a bit too aggressive for me. I remember going to a concert and just feeling like I was in danger to be at a concert, and I didn't like that feeling. So I started to explore other music, and I found Sublime and reggae music. So I started listening to Sublime, and I think you guys probably know where this heads. Sublime led to Scarlet Begonias. I remember I was delivering pizza at the time, and I was working with this guy, Ben. And all I knew about Ben was that he smoked a lot of weed and liked the Grateful Dead. And I was like, oh, I smoke a lot of weed. I should probably give the Grateful Dead a chance. So I was a little bit younger than everyone else my age. So I was 20 when my friends were 21. They all went out to the bars. I was stuck drinking at the apartment by myself. And I remember I threw on Ripple, like the studio version of Ripple. And I was like, is this really what this whole band is about? Not that Ripple's not a great song. I just couldn't get the scope of the band based on the studio version of Ripple. So a couple weeks later, I stumble upon Scarlet Fire from Cornell, your dad's second show. And I saw Scarlet Begonias. I recognized the title, and it was just a spiral into the Grateful Dead from there.
Do you still jam on Sublime?
It's not that I don't like it anymore. I just have a very hard time listening to anything but the Dead. It's, I'm sure, as you guys all know, very addictive. There's always that next show you want to see, and the next year you want to explore, and you go back to old favorites and hear a new riff or a new layer to that song that you didn't know exists. So it's not that I don't dabble in it. I just don't have enough time to dabble in it.
When you have a hard time listening to anything but the Dead, does that cause you any guilt?
Yes and no. I do want to be able to listen to the other music. It's more like the internal clock, and I know time's ticking, and I want to listen to as much Dead as I can with the time I got on this planet, and I don't have that same drive for the other music that I enjoy. So,
do you have that outlook towards everything in life? Are you constantly aware of time?
Oh yeah, time is my best friend and my worst enemy. I'm constantly thinking of time. I'm constantly trying to manage my time and make sure I'm balancing my time, spending it not only on the things I enjoy, but the people I care about, doing things that I want to look back and appreciate my time doing. And you'd think I'd like the song The Wheel a little bit more, but that's not one of my favorites.
When did you start becoming so existentially minded?
Psychedelics, that same year of college that I discovered the Grateful Dead. I think that all kind of tied in, and one does not exist without the other, in my life at least.
So it's very pragmatic. You're not spending your time worried about getting hit by a taxi. You're just aware of it.
Yeah, I'm not worried about it, but I know that it could happen, and I want to make sure that I'm using my time wisely in case something like that were to happen. And just to tie the story back together, I went to my first Dead & Company show in 2019. We got some tabs from the lot. It was a complete downpour, like studio level rain coming in. This show got canceled, but the whole kind of full circle was that we're walking up to the show, and who do I see selling t-shirts, taking part in the vending experience? My boy Ben, who I delivered pizza with. So it all came full circle.
Oh my God.
Incredible.
Huh. That's wild.
Annabelle, could you talk a little bit about the intersection of psychedelics and deadhead fashion?
Well, I think I was talking to one of my students about this today, thinking about sort of the symbolic fit of the imagery and the visual culture, the music, the substances. It all makes sense together, right? Like tie-dye is the perfect visual metaphor for the psychedelic experience. So in that sense, I think there's a very clear link. But also in terms of my favorite and sort of where I've focused a lot of my research in the last couple of years, looking at lot t-shirts from what I call the post-Touch of Grey era, from 87 to 95. A lot of the sort of parody t-shirts that emerged. So these are t-shirts that are, the way I define it, is taking symbols from mainstream culture and hijacking them in some way and subverting them. So think of like the Bart Simpson t-shirts, Fred Flintstone, things like that. A lot of those, especially the t-shirts with the cartoon characters, they make reference to psychedelics, right? They're sort of almost poking fun. They're sort of self-referential in a way, and poking fun at what at the time was actually very contentious, right? In terms of psychedelics within the dead scene and sort of what that led to in terms of deadheads being arrested. And, some deadheads are still incarcerated to this day. Like when I was in college, I interned at the Relics office, and I remember, or I interned at Relics magazine. I remember being in the office, and they would get mail from people who were still in prison because they were either buying or selling on the lot in the 90s. So there was a lot of discourse in the late 80s and 90s where people were sort of criticizing that whole phenomenon. And I've also tied that to the imagery that you start to see in the t-shirts in the late 80s and 90s in terms of not only are you seeing the cartoon characters that are sort of deadified, that are made into Grateful Dead icons, and that are sort of tacitly referring to a lot of the stereotypes that proliferated at the time about deadheads, but you're also seeing imagery. Like one of my favorite t-shirts is this Dead Express t-shirt. So it's the American Express card, but the Gladiator logo is replaced with a Steely. And instead of American Express, it's Dead Express. And it's the American Express slogan from the time. I think it's membership has its privileges. And so I've looked at that shirt and sort of read it through that lens of, is this a way of kind of responding to the almost like corporatization of the parking lot, if I can call it that, where it's sort of like you're starting to see deadheads. They know that they can't stop this from happening. So instead of trying to resist, they're just kind of incorporating the imagery and responding to and subverting it in some way as sort of this ambivalent response to all of the chaos that ensued in the late 80s and 90s.
To tack on to what you're saying, Annabelle, so I remember in 91, first Gulf War was like January of 91. So I remember summer 91 seeing the Dead, and there was an army of people selling shirts who were clearly not deadheads. And they had literal like big sacks with huge shirts. Now, people selling shirts usually had a backpack with maybe 10 of them in that because they didn't want to get busted. They would hold the shirt up, right? Like that was usually how people sold shirts. And the shirt said Operation Dead Tour, like as if it was a play on like Operation Desert Storm. And all we could think is like, you're selling a shirt that's referencing a war for oil. And they were dirt cheap. They were like $5 a shirt or something. They were ostracized. Like people were like, get away.
Hey, at least heads weren't into it, right? I love lot drama personally. And Annabelle, actually, recently on the Dead & Co lot, there were accusations of design theft for bootlegs. And I'm wondering where the line is between kind of keeping the bit, the inside joke alive versus design theft.
What I spoke about at the Dead Scholars Conference last year was sort of this idea of thinking about dead t-shirts almost as fashion memes, and how dead t-shirts sort of embody the cultural logic of memes. So what I was talking about is kind of this idea of thinking about dead t-shirts as networked images where they all serve to reinforce each other, and they're all constantly referencing and kind of building off of each other. And so if we think about like the incorporation of Bart Simpson as a dead icon, well, we can't read Bart Simpson as a Grateful Dead icon unless that becomes this sort of series of images where people are incorporating Bart into the t-shirt, right? He's not inherently a Grateful Dead icon in the way that the Steely or the Skull and Roses is, right? So it sort of requires people to reference each other's work. And I mean, I think the distinction here is that people should in theory be building off of each other's work. So the idea with memes is that, right, with a meme, there's some level of variation with each iteration of the meme. So I wouldn't say that I support people just blatantly ripping each other off, but I think a lot of the t-shirts operate in this sort of networked way where they're constantly in conversation with each other.
Thank you, Annabelle. Well, we have 2 more songs. The score is 1-1. Let's hear Annabelle's second choice of the finals. So the guesses are in. It was Going Down the Road, Feeling Bad at Providence Civic Center in Providence, Rhode Island on April 4th, 1985. That was taped by the Ode brothers. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I chose this song because it's from my mom's first Dead show. So my mom got on the bus a little bit later than my dad, but that's also because she's a little bit younger. I was asking her, just like I did with my dad, to recount her memories of this show, and she has very few memories, and I wonder why that could be. She has very few memories of most of the Dead shows she attended. I noticed a theme in...
Me too.
Yeah, I noticed a theme, though, is that the things that she seems to remember is that she was always losing things. Like she lost her brother at a show, couldn't find her car after one show, she couldn't find the parking garage where she parked her car at another show. All that she was really able to tell me was that this was her first Dead show. This was spring of her freshman year of college at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. And she and her friend from school showed up ticketless, and they got in the door for $15, and the rest was a blur. But I chose this Going Down the Road, Feeling Bad because as I was revisiting this show, I've listened to it a number of times over the years. I couldn't get over the tempo, just how fast it is. And I don't mean to stir up controversy on this podcast. I feel like I've already done that by calling out Gabe. But it was so fast that I felt compelled to then pull up a Going Down the Road, Feeling Bad from the Sphere last year and listen to them side by side. And it's like they're 2 different songs. It's so crazy. The tempo they're just markedly different. I can't, as someone who never got to see the Dead, and especially not in 85, I just can't even imagine being at a show like this where they were playing that fast.
was a great choice. And Corey was closer, 1984. You were 1 year off, Corey. Pete guessed 1982, so he was 3 years off. Corey goes up by 2 going into the last song. Corey, 1984, what were you feeling there?
I just listened to all of 1985 except for the last few shows, and I did not remember there being a recording like that. But granted, if you go through, I'm a bit of a data hoarder, and I started downloading a whole bunch of shows. And if you go through like Lossless Legs or E-Tree, there's like 20 different recordings for every show in 1985. So my knowledge of the recordings is not really going to help me. But it was the blistering pace of it. I really did not come around to going down the road until I started listening to 1985. And the pace reminded me a lot of the China Riders from that year, which I describe as a frenzy because they really just kind of whip it up. And by the time they're done with China, they go back into Rider. And I got that same vibe from that. And Brent's just going crazy on the keys and the organ. So that's kind of what cued me in.
Is there such thing as too fast?
No. I enjoy the cocaine years of the Grateful Dead.
Pete, 82.
Yeah, Jerry's playing so well there and at such a blistering pace. And when I hear him playing like that, I think of actually mostly JGB stuff from like 81. Like I almost guessed 81. I was almost sure it was 81, just purely off of Jerry. Brent's organ and kind of the fullness of the band pulled me a little bit later, and I almost ended up in 84 where Corey was. But 84 is such a weird year. So anyway, long story short, I landed on 82. As far as tempo and pacing, like just to finish, like while we're talking about that, don't speed up my eyes. Don't speed up my estimated eyes. Like I don't love those super fast versions of the early 80s. I like hated when they did that. But that's just me. I'm like, there's something so beautiful about Eyes of the World that it's meant to be savored. But nice guess, Corey. That was good.
I was shoveling my dirt in my backyard the other day, and I had a hot take that aligns with that, and that's the sped up, the 73, they love each other. I think it's okay,
Right.
but I think they all sound the same, and I don't mind a slow, they love each other.
Okay.
There it is.
That's a pretty hot take right there.
Shooting from the hip. I've never heard anything but good things
like
about the sped up, they love each other on the show. I'm like, I think I like the slower, they love each other.
Mike,
Right.
you're about to get canceled. Podcast over.
Yeah. You better look out, Mike. I know.
About to get swatted during the next recording, yeah. Corey is up by 2 going into the third of 3 songs. Before we hear Annabelle's 5th pick, Annabelle, how did you get into the Dead?
Well, I sort of alluded to it. I am what you'd call a second generation Deadhead. So both my mother and father are Deadheads. I would say they relate to the Dead, and their love for the Dead is sort of different. My dad's love is a bit more intense and obsessive in the way that mine is. He's in a couple great Dead cover bands in Massachusetts. Shout out to Direwolf and Live Dead. Go check them out. I'm shouting out all my Dead cover bands. Got to support the local Dead cover bands. But my parents never, I always say they never imposed any sort of Deadhead agenda on me. I was hearing the music in the background as a kid, but for the longest time when I was, during my childhood, I thought it was just some kind of niche band that my parents listened to. And I remember seeing like a stack of Dick's Picks CDs in my dad's car and thinking, because my dad's name is Richard, that these were like CDs that he burned and that he gave them some clever name, Dick's Picks. I remember seeing a Dead t-shirt in the wild as a kid and coming home and telling my dad, "Oh my God, Dad, I saw a Grateful Dead t-shirt today. Someone was wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt." And I remember him saying, "Yeah, Annabelle, they're a pretty big band." But I just had no idea as a kid. My parents, so I guess the point is that my parents didn't take me to shows. They weren't really going to shows post 95. So I didn't grow up going to see, any of the post Jerry incarnations really, but I did go to my dad's gigs. And so I was aware of the music in that way. But it wasn't really until high school that I kind of locked into the music. And again, I mentioned the Dick's Picks Volume 15, English Town 77. I think that was sort of the turning point for me when I listened to that show. It was the first live show that I consciously listened to, like by choice. And I just remember it blew my mind. And all of a sudden, that was sort of my moment of understanding how my parents could listen to the same band, and especially my dad, virtually every single day for 40, 50 years and not get tired of it. So yeah, to answer your question, it was through my parents, but really in high school is when I started consciously getting into the Dead. And there were weirdly a lot of Deadheads in my high school too. So there were a lot of people who were going to shows and were into the music.
And when did you start investigating the Dead in academia?
It started when I was in undergrad, actually, because during that time, I noticed this sort of trend that was emerging where just a handful of high-end brands and designers that I really liked were putting out Grateful Dead inspired capsule collections. And that was a total, I hope I can swear on this podcast, it was kind of a mind fuck for me when that happened, because it felt like my two worlds coming together in the strangest of ways, where growing up, I always kind of saw the Dead and fashion as these two diametrically opposed things. And then to see them converge in that way was confusing and weird, but also kind of exciting. And I was just very curious about why this was happening, what it meant, sort of the significance of it. So I kind of started there with my research in terms of looking at this burgeoning trend that it really defies all fashion trend logic, where typically a trend is sort of short-lived and ephemeral, but and it may last only for a season. But this sort of phenomenon of designers releasing Dead-inspired collections that happened, like it started in 2016. It was really like post Fare Thee Well cultural resurgence of the Dead when you started to see this crop up. And it was really like hot through all the way through 2020. Like I remember during COVID, there was the whole kind of like tie-dye was fashionable, and a lot of people were tying that back to the Dead. But then you also had designers who were explicitly referencing the Dead and, you know, putting Steal Your Faces and the Skull and Roses on their designs and things like that. So that's where I started. And then I kind of moved away from the high fashion piece and got more interested in what Deadheads make and sell and wear in the lot or on the lot.
I'm a big fan of Online Ceramics, which is run by these two guys who moved from the Midwest to Los Angeles and started selling on lot. John Mayer found them. They got really big. What role did they play in your mind, if any, in this lot resurgence?
They play a really important role. I remember that was one of the brands that I was looking at and was quite interested in, because John Mayer was a very early supporter of Online Ceramics, and they started sort of their brand by selling in the lot outside Dead & Company shows. And now they've done collaborations with Marc Jacobs and A24 and all of these big names, both in and outside of fashion. So I think they play a role in sort of, I don't want to say that the lot scene ever died, but from what I've heard from people who were on Further Tour selling things in the parking lot, there wasn't a lot happening. There wasn't a huge amount of activity in sort of the vending scene and the lot scene. And I think that Online Ceramics and John Mayer's early support of Online Ceramics sort of allowed the lot scene to really proliferate in the sort of Dead & Company era.
What about Online Ceramics' aesthetic? And I'd recommend anyone who's listening to Google it. It's worth checking out. Why do you think it resonated with Deadheads enough to spark this resurgence?
I think they're tapping into a sense of nostalgia. I think their aesthetic is very much tied to kind of early internet, almost like Microsoft Paint and early cyber aesthetics. It's very kind of lo-fi, DIY, but intentional, right? So I think it's like this sort of idea of nostalgia, and the aesthetic of their brand and of the t-shirts sort of reminds us of early internet when things were a lot more innocent, sort of the cyber world. That's my take on it.
Nailed it. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of Section 119? I mean, I'm a big Fish fan, and that kind of was born out of that. But I know they do a lot of dead stuff too. And then you said expensive shirts, and I was like, yeah.
That's just the tip of the iceberg, Pete. There's some stuff that was coming out like 2016 through 2018. Like Proenza Schooler is a brand that was founded by 2 Parsons graduates, and they did a dead capsule collection in, I think, 2018. And they were selling 13-point bolt purses for like over $1,000. And then Alice and Olivia, a women's wear brand based in New York, they were one of the first brands to put out this dead capsule collection. And she sold this full length, sort of like almost ball gown-esque skirt with the dancing bears on it, and that retailed for like $3,500.
Oh my God. I'm not telling my wife about any of this.
Yeah, don't tell her.
she's a huge deadhead and a sucker for the 13 bolt. And anyway.
But I mean, the thing with Alice and Olivia, what I found through my research, because at a cursory glance, I'm looking at it, I'm just thinking all of these people are just trying to, kind of like what we were talking about before with the capitalists who are encroaching on the parking lot in the late 80s. I assume that all of these people were just trying to kind of capitalize on the cultural resurgence of the Dead without having any real connection to the band. But what I found through digging a little bit deeper and interviewing some of these people, like James Pearce, for example, was one of the first designers to put out a Dead collection. He was in 2018. And he got his start selling baseball caps in the lot, or on the lot in the 90s. So he's like a tried and true Deadhead who, you know, just eventually built this incredible fashion brand and sort of had this full circle moment 20, 30 years later when he got to design this Dead collection. But that's sort of like where he got his start as a designer. And then Stacey Bendit, the creative director of Alice and Olivia, her connection was that her husband is Eric Eisner, who was one of the producers of Long Strange Trip. So it was sort of inspired by, I think, she went to Fare Thee Well with Eric and saw sort of a need for female deadheads to have cool clothes to wear, and sort of wanted to pay homage to, you know, the band and this band that her husband loves so much.
And Will Welch, the GQ editor, I was standing next to him all 3 nights at the Dead & Co. final shows.
There's deadheads all over every single industry. I think that's what every field, politics, right? Fashion, media, fine art. We're everywhere, right?
And so you run the Deadhead Style Archive. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was a project I started while I was in grad school, and it was sort of building on my research and trying to better understand, as I mentioned earlier, the different ways in which people sort of perform their deadhead identity through fashion, whether that be what they put on their bodies or what they make and sell in the parking lot. Because I think there are a lot of these stereotypes that I mentioned before, these certain ideas or conceptions that we have about what it means to look like a deadhead. But what I found from opening up this archive and starting the archive is that there's so much more to it. And there are so many different ways that people express their deadhead identity through fashion. So it was really important to me for this to be a participatory archive and for it to be sort of open-ended in the sense that I'm not just looking to include photos of t-shirts, although I love to see t-shirts, right? But we have a lot of that already. So also things like dresses, the calico pants, you know, hemp jewelry, all of that. I love to see all of that, the hats, the pins, and then also just the different ways that people style their clothing. And what I found is that there are people who, they interpret this very literally, right? They're sharing photos of them wearing like a Dead t-shirt, but then there are also people who are submitting photos of them in like white flowy dresses. And it's like, that isn't explicitly a Dead garment, right? But it's something that you might wear to a show, and it's your own way of kind of styling yourself and being a deadhead and expressing that through fashion.
Thank you, Annabelle. And you have another song for us, and Corey just needs to be within 2 years and he wins. Pete needs to make up some ground. Let's hear the 5th of 5 songs, unless there's an extra one in case of a tie. It was Foolish Heart at Buckeye Lake Music Center in Hebron, Ohio on June 11th, 1993.
I was at that show. Oh my God.
That's probably why you don't remember it, Pete. We've been talking about all night. Annabelle, tell us about that Foolish Heart.
Well, I'll be honest, Mike, this was sort of a practical pick in that I was thinking game show logic. I realized in developing my list that it was kind of 70s centric, and I'm by no means a 70s dead purist, so I figured I needed to kind of diversify a little bit and throw in some dead from the later years. But I picked Foolish Heart because, I mean, this is just a great version of Foolish Heart. Super fun. And I have sort of a contentious relationship with this song where, and I'll spare you the details, but in high school, I had a very brief tenure working for someone as sort of like a house cleaner. And going into this job, that's not what I thought it was. I thought it was going to be more of like organizing business records and things of that nature. And then I discovered that I was going to be cleaning a house, and not a very clean house at that. And I'll just leave it there. And
Awful.
every time I came in to clean, she would make me listen to Built to Last, the album. And that was 2 months every week. I had to be subjected to that album. And I just grew to absolutely detest that album. And it took me a while to kind of, I think this sort of speaks to the way that music can bring us back to a very specific time and place, because for years afterward, anytime I heard any song off of that album, whether it be the studio version or in a live show, it just like brought me back to those painful memories of being a house cleaner in high school. So for a while, I did not like Foolish Heart. I did not like any song off of that album. I didn't want to hear them. And I don't really know when that changed and what changed it for me, but I've come around to a few of the songs. I love Foolish Heart now. I love Built to Last. Standing on the Moon, I always loved. I never really had traumatic memories associated with that song. But Victim or the Crime, I still haven't come around to. So I don't know, maybe someone needs to put me through Victim or the Crime boot camp so I can see the light, but it hasn't happened for me yet.
So this person whose house you cleaned was just a Built to Last studio album fanatic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Whoa. I need to have them on Guest of the Year.
so
This
random.
is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so wild. And they didn't play other Grateful Dead, just Built to Last studio album.
Yeah, not that I can recall, but I do distinctly remember this person having like an extensive collection of CDs. But it seemed like we only listened. I don't know if that was the only Dead CD and they were trying to relate to me because they knew I was a Deadhead. But yeah.
I was
like
going to
that
ask, do you think they just thought you liked that one?
Yeah,
You know?
maybe I seemed to be enjoying it, kind of dancing while I was cleaning. They're like, all right, let's just play it every single time. I don't know.
That's probably what it was. Well, you guys had the same guess, 1990. which means Corey's the new champ of Guest of the Year. Congrats, Corey.
Congrats, Corey.
Thank you. Thank you.
Way to go, man.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Pete's a
Thank you.
real
Well
tough
played,
guy.
Pete.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
tell us about 1990.
Well, just like Annabelle's pick for kind of picking that song for the game, you said I needed 2 years, and I knew that was the late 80s, or that it appeared somewhere around the late 80s. So I figured 1990 was a safe guess. That gives me from 88 to 92 to be safe. So that's why I went with 90 more than anything. I was really trying to pick out the keys, but you could not hear the keys at all on that one.
Right.
Yeah, Pete, tell us no keys.
I was trying to hear the keys. They were definitely down in the mix. And so I couldn't pick it up. Again, I was at that show. It's a phenomenal Foolish Heart. I love Foolish Heart. I was just listening to Foolish Heart like 2 days ago. And I was listening to like an 89 version, and it was really reminding me of that. And I was like, yeah, but maybe it's a little later. So I went to 90. But I'm glad I was at least kind of close. But honestly, thank you, Mike, for having me on the show. It was awesome. I want to say to Tomas, like just being a guest on this show, I'm the old guy here, but it's really cool to see that we had like pretty much all generations represented here. And I think that just speaks to the Grateful Dead and their ability that they truly are. The music is timeless. It's cross-generational. It's whether your parents raised you on it or not, you grew up around it like Annabelle, or like Corey, who just kind of stumbled into it because he heard Sublime listen to a tune, or like Tomas, who was on, who's got a father in it, and he's a musician. I love it. It gives me hope for the world that people keep discovering the Grateful Dead and find this joy in their life. And so anyway, this show's really cool because it brings all these people together. And I think it's just awesome.
Thanks, Pete.
I want to bounce off Pete too. Before I discovered your podcast, I don't have very many people around me who listen to the Dead. I'm pretty much the only one. So I kind of felt like this was a dying breed of people. And going back to my whole thinking about time, I was like, man, are all these people who grew up with the Dead just going to die out, and the Dead are going to die out with these people? Then I'm going to be like alone on an island listening to this band that no one else listens to. But listening to your show, it's great to see people like Tomas and just people still coming into the Dead. It gives me hope that the music I enjoy will outlive me. So ditto to what Pete said.
Beautiful. Thanks, Corey. Thank you, Pete. And Annabelle, it's been such a pleasure listening to your perspective. And I'm wondering, what is next in your studies of Grateful Dead fashion?
Well, I'm heading down to New Orleans next week for the Dead Studies conference. So I'm looking forward to that. Really what I'm focusing on next week is kind of looking at or reframing our understanding of Deadhead style, and also positioning Deadheads as a fluid fashion culture. I think this term fashion is very charged. And I found in my research, just in terms of interviewing people over the years, that a lot of people run from that word and they don't identify with that word. And often when I use that word, or I really don't use it anymore, but when I first kind of started out doing this research and I used that word in asking people questions, people would cite the lyrics, doesn't matter what you wear, just as long as you are there, which is all well and good, but I'm kind of trying to make the point that there is some significance to what people are wearing.
Right.
But I've just had to be more strategic in the language that I'm using, and using more kind of neutral language. But in my presentation, I'll be kind of walking through what fashion actually means. So from a scholarly perspective, how is fashion defined? And really all fashion is just kind of change over time. And so I think with that definition in mind, there's a case to be made that what Deadheads are doing with the clothes they put on their bodies can be understood as fashion, because it's not static. Contrary to popular belief, it's always changing, and people are always kind of reimagining the style codes and taking the imagery and the iconography and reinterpreting it. So according to that definition, I think it is fashion.
Last question. Is fashion cyclical, like everyone says? And is Deadhead fashion cyclical?
Fashion is cyclical, broadly speaking, yes. I often think of it as sort of a pendulum where it's always swinging back and forth from one extreme to another. I don't necessarily see dead fashion as cyclical, though maybe someone else might have that perspective. I see it as always kind of building on itself. So I think what sort of separates it from the broader fashion system is that often, like I said, we see the pendulum swinging back and forth, and people will embrace one thing, and then the next season they ardently reject that in favor of the complete opposite. And I think what you see in the dead scene instead is sort of like a gradual development and gradual integration of new ideas, but most things don't necessarily get abandoned per se. I think we're always just kind of building on the vocabulary and adding new things to it.
Thank you, Annabelle.
Thank you.
And thank you, Pete and Corey and Tomas and Adam. What a way to kick off this season. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. For all the show links, including our YouTube channel, go to guesttheyear.net. If you want to be a contestant on the show, sponsor the show, or make comments and ask questions, email us at info@guesttheyear.net. Shout out to Dylan, James, and Jack for helping out behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Annabelle, for coming on the show. The Deadhead Style Archive link and the link to her Instagram are in the show notes. Congratulations to Corey on the big win, and to other contestants, thanks for playing, and remember, it's all one song anyway.
And I bid you good night, good night, good night. And I bid you good night, good night, good night.